This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan, and in for Amy J. This morning, Kristen McQuarrie from the Chicago Tribune editorial board. And when he wasn't enduring Hirano's harangues or enjoying slapping stolen valor Blumenthal around, Attorney General William Barr talked about the investigation that is happening into how the Russian collusion investigation started. And he was asked to comment on the accepted narrative of how it started involving George Papadopoulos, who we spoke to last week, you recall. Here's what Bill Barr said under questioning of that sort.
Investigation into the Trump campaign began on July 31st, 2016, after a foreign government contacted the FBI about comments made by George Papadopoulos. Is that accurate, or were there other precipitating events that helped lead to this?
That is the account that has been given in the past as to how it got going.
Now, you've previously said that you think it's possible that the Federal Bureau of Investigation improperly spied on the Trump campaign. I assume that's a reference to the FISA warrant for Carter Page. Is that what you have in mind, or are there other circumstances that you've got in mind there?
Well, one of the things I want to look there are many people seem to assume that the only intelligence collection that occurred was a single confidential informant and a FISA warrant. I'd like to find out whether that is in fact true. It strikes me as a fairly anemic effort if that was the counterintelligence effort designed to stop the threat as it's being represented.
Maybe it was, it's probably good instinct on Barr's part that it would strike him as fairly anemic, the effort, because there's other efforts that were afoot that don't, that the parties do not want disclosed. And John Solomon, who we've cited many times here for his investigative work in this whole area over the last 24 months, John Solomon, who's a contributor, investigative journalist, and executive VP at thehill.com, has a piece out this week about Nellie Ohr. Remember her? Nellie and Bruce? Peter Strzok and Lisa Page weren't the only lovebirds in the DOJ FBI orbit. Nellie Ohr, who worked for Fusion GPS, wife of Bruce Ohr, who was number 3 in Obama's Justice Department, emails from Nellie to her husband and his colleagues raised the prospect that the Hillary Clinton-funded Op Research was being funneled into the Justice Department during the 2016 election through this backdoor marital channel, and was the communications between the Ohrs and their colleagues something that provided the basis for the initiation of the collusion investigation. For more on this and the rest of his work, we're pleased to be joined by John Solomon. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So Nellie Ohr's emails, her hi honey emails, as you term them,
yes,
to Bruce or her husband at Justice. Give us an example of the emails that have now been released that are curious, if not, if not indicative of something nefarious afoot.
Yeah, in fact, I have some breaking news. Late last night, Congressman Mark Meadows, Republican North Carolina, one of the ranking members on the House Oversight Committee, sent a formal criminal referral to the Justice Department asking Attorney General Barr to investigate Nellie Ohr on two counts. One, that she gave inaccurate or false testimony to Congress last fall, and that she might have used or abused her husband's position to try to get her own contractors' information into the Justice Department. So that referral was sent last night, and it will likely initiate some sort of procedure inside the Justice Department. So this has moved from beyond just the release of documents now to a formal request for investigation. Why is this important? Well, as you rightly pointed out, her husband was a senior Justice Department official, and over the course of the 2016 election, while she was working for Hillary Clinton's opposition research firm, Fusion GPS, She was feeding 399 pages of intelligence to the Justice Department, not just to her husband, where she often addressed her emails, "Hi, honey," but to 3 prosecutors in the International Criminal Section of the Justice Department. And what was she sending? She was sending things like the first notice that they had found the black ledger in Ukraine that showed payments to Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. She was sending information that Carter Page had gone to Moscow to give a speech and might have had contacts with the Gazprom Russian company. She was sending very strong anti-Trump screeds. In fact, one that she sent basically called Donald Trump the perfect candidate if Vladimir Putin was trying to create one to destroy America. So very partisan, but more importantly, very similar to the research she was doing at Fusion GPS. Several of the names she testified to in Congress that she was looking at, people like Ovid Deripaska, Renat Al-Ahmed, they were the type of people that she was funneling information to the Justice Department. That's important because when she was asked last year by Congress, did you share your Fusion GPS research with anyone besides your company, your husband, and Christopher Steele, she answered no. This looks to be evidence that maybe some of that research was sent to people other than her husband.
So she forgot about those 399 pages that she had emailed to people outside of her husband, including, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, there were 3 prosecutors. And in fact, at one point, her husband's colleagues asked for permission to talk to her about something. My reporting indicates they wanted to pump her for information about Russian oligarchs. Well, that was the angle that she was looking at as a possible angle of attack for Donald Trump in the campaign in 2016. So there's a two-way communication going on between Nellie Ohr and Bruce Ohr's colleagues inside the Justice Department, something we didn't know about before.
And just the 2 points on which Meadows made the criminal referral. One, lying to Congress. Okay, you've outlined that. And the second was, be explicit about that again.
Yeah, the potential that there's a conflict of interest here. A spouse shouldn't be allowed under the ethics rules to profit or benefit her company through her husband's position. That's always been the presiding policy of ethics. And in fact, you can see in some of the times when the Justice Department is talking to Bruce and saying, his colleagues are saying, hey, do you mind if we talk to our Nellie, does it cause you any concerns about conflicts? Even the Justice Department officials reaching out to Nellie had a concern that because she was working for a vendor with a very clear interest, that there might be a conflict of interest issue here. Bruce Ohr has always said that he told everybody in the Justice Department who his wife worked for, and he tried to at least be clear about it. That doesn't necessarily absolve the conflict. I think Mark Meadows asked that also be resolved. And was this an appropriate use of the Justice Department to have emails coming from Hillary Clinton's vendor through her husband to Justice Department officials?
is there more of a firm line versus a dotted line between her sending all the emails and then the Justice Department outside of the asking to speak to her? Were there other things that they did based on her information that you have been able to ascertain?
Well, one of the seminal moments we know is that on July 30th, 2016, Bruce Ohr, as the Associate Deputy Attorney General, brought Nellie Ohr, his wife, to a meeting with Christopher Steele. Now, at that point, Nellie Ohr says she didn't know she knew who Christopher Steele was, a British intelligence operative, but she didn't know he was also working for her firm, Fusion GPS. But she learned that day that Christopher Steele was working for Fusion GPS and that he had approached her husband specifically to get dirt on Donald Trump to the FBI in hopes that they would launch an investigation. She testifies to that fact. The next day, Bruce Ohr, after meeting with Christopher Steele, goes and reports to the FBI Deputy Director, Andrew McCabe, all the stuff that Christopher Steele said, basically the dossier. It's on that same day that the Justice Department opens Operation Crossfire Hurricane, which is the investigation into the Trump campaign. So in a 24-hour window, we go from Steele, Ohr, and Ohr meeting to Bruce Ohr contacting FBI then initiating an investigation. People are looking at that time frame and Nellie Ohr's participation in what should have been an official Justice Department meeting and asking, why was she there? Well, let's take a look at what she does afterwards. In August, she starts sending a lot of information that are much more specific to the Trump campaign, things about Carter Page, things about Paul Manafort, things about Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador. So after she learns that Christopher Steele's approached the FBI about possibly fanning an investigation of Donald Trump, she accelerates these sort of intelligence jumps on the Justice Department. A lot of the things in those emails are things that later became part of the Russian narrative. And so I think there's a lot of questions that need to be resolved. She deserves the presumption of innocence until we learn more. But there's enough of a pattern there that at least a key member of Congress wants an investigation now.
And the issue of the Steele dossier, there's other documents that have been released that suggest that Bruce Ohr expressed some skepticism about the veracity of the contents of the Steele dossier, right?
That's right. A year ago, I broke that story about those memos. And so Bruce Ohr, very early on, did the right thing in the sense that he told the FBI, even though he was feeding the information from Christopher Steele. And keep in mind, Bruce Ohr has an issue because Steele and his wife are colleagues at the same company, and he's now forwarding his information to the FBI. That raises another concern about conflicts in some people's minds. But he's very clear with the FBI and with senior Justice Department officials that he believes Christopher Steele has something to do with the Hillary Clinton campaign, that he is desperate, that's the word that Bruce Ohr used in his notes, desperate to defeat Donald Trump at the polls. This is derogatory information that normally weighs against the credibility of a confidential source like Christopher Steele, yet it was never disclosed to the FISA court. So you have Bruce Ohr smart enough to tell the Justice Department and FBI, hey, I got some concerns about this guy's motives and his employer, and yet the FBI, when they go and get the FISA warrant to spy on the Trump campaign, remove that information and are not clear with the court about those concerns. I believe next week we're going to learn a lot more about just how much derogatory information the FBI had weighing against Christopher Steele's credibility that they hid from the American public and from the FISA court. I think next week will be a very big week in the development of this story.
What do you expect next week exactly?
I think we're going to learn new points of information that the FBI was receiving that cast doubt on both Steele's motives and the accuracy of his information. I think that's a very important thing.
But from where?
If you look back, for more than a year now, I've raised the prospect in my reporting, because my sources have, that this might have been a Russian intelligence disinformation campaign, what is known as a discoverable influence operation. I even had the former CIA station chief in Moscow on the record saying, we got this wrong. This wasn't a collusion effort. This was a disinformation effort. Well, I think you're going to learn more in the next few weeks about why the FBI had fears about Steele and the possibility he was being played, and yet did not disclose those fears as they're supposed to the court. I think that's the sort of stuff Bill Barr is talking about when he's talking about launching his own investigation.
In terms of Nellie Ohr, if this does just lead down a path where there was a conflict of interest, possibly an abuse of a position in order to further the contract, I mean, that's not necessarily criminal behavior, is it? It's just...
it can be, right? It can be if her husband didn't take the proper steps within the department to disclose the conflict. So there are under the law, there are two ways to avoid criminal exposure in a conflict. One is recusal. I just don't do anything with my wife that's related to my job. That clearly didn't happen here because Bruce Ohr is bringing Nellie Ohr to the meeting with Steele. He's facilitating communications between her and his colleagues. So he didn't recuse himself. The question is, how properly did he disclose the conflict, and did it get weighed through the proper channels? And Bruce Ohr testifies he told everyone about his wife's role, and nobody seemed to be worried about it. Whether that rises to the proper level of disclosure and a waiver on a conflict of interest to avoid criminality, we don't know yet, and I think that's why Mark Meadows sends a letter. Now that we have a lot more information about Nellie Ohr's direct contact with DOJ, I think somebody is going to have to look at that and make a ruling on both of those issues.
So the information you're suggesting will be forthcoming about the Russian disinformation campaign and the amount of skepticism that existed in FBI and or DOJ circles. Does that also suggest that the leadership of DOJ, Loretta Lynch, the leadership at FBI, Jim Comey and others, either knowingly disregarded that skepticism or were willfully blind to it?
Well, that is a great question. We've had James Comey say in testimony and in his book and in some of his public statements on television, he really didn't know much about the Steele dossier and didn't know about its connections to Hillary Clinton's campaign. That's extraordinary because he signed the first FISA warrant. And ignorance is not a defense in the FISA court. You have to make an affirmative statement to the court that I've checked all this information, that it is credible and verified, and before you submit it and ask the judges to issue a warrant. Comey himself creates an enormous conflict in this because all throughout his tenure as FBI director, including in public testimonies, he kept calling the Steele dossier unverified and salacious. Remember those two terms he used? If he thought it was unverified and salacious, why did he allow his FBI to then use it as the primary or substantial evidence to justify spying on the Trump campaign? There's an inherent conflict in James Comey's behavior and words, and I think that's some of the stuff that you see Bill Barr now addressing in these testimonies. And just a few weeks ago, the New York Times, which was a large cheerleader for the Russian collusion story for 2 years, has now stepped back and said, you know what? We think maybe the Steele dossier was a Russian disinformation campaign. That's an extraordinary pivot for that news organization. The reason for these pivots, there's a growing body of evidence that we got the Steele dossier wrong. The American government did not assess it correctly.
He is John Solomon. He's an award-winning investigative journalist and executive VP at thehill.com. His latest piece is Nellie Ohr's High Honey emails that get at thehill.com. But also, if you haven't been following the particulars of this and you want to catch up real quickly in the last 2 years, just go back and search John Solomon and read all of the investigative reporting he's done, because it's been excellent from the beginning to today. John Solomon, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for the attention to this story. Much appreciated.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 646.